School City of Hobart here. Remember, we are returning to learn. We're ever grateful, ever true. Together, we will protect our brickies. And so, if we were to hop out to our site and go to our Protect Brickies page, we would land right here as you see on the screen. And so, remember that the one thing that will make this plan work is you, me, all of us together. All my life, we are working. And in this case, working to protect brickies. So I want to highlight for you a document that the Indiana State Department of Health provided that's on our Protect Brickies site, and it provides guidance on returning to school. And so if you click on that link, you'll be sent to a two-page PDF. Again, this two-page PDF was provided by the Indiana State Department of Health, and up top it tells you that this is regarding when a student, faculty, or staff member can return to school. The first page of the document provides you with information on the individual and what the case might be for that individual and what would happen for return to school if symptomatic or no symptoms are present. Also, there's a little note here at the bottom of the screen, which is helpful. We can zoom in and look at it. And the note says, hey, when we say, and by we, the Indiana State Department of Health, say quarantine, what we mean by that is keeping someone who was in close contact with someone who has COVID-19 away from others. And they say when we say isolation, we're referring to keeping someone who's sick or tested positive for COVID-19 without symptoms away from others, even in their own home. And so let's go ahead and let's look up top at the first row, and let's just give an idea of what this chart offers us. So here's an individual. The individual was not tested, but they have alternate explanations for their COVID-19 scenario, right? So maybe that's like strep throat, influenza, etc. That's determined by the healthcare provider. Well, if that individual is symptomatic, how would we know when they can return to school? Well, if that individual is symptomatic, the Indiana State Department of Health says that they may return to school after 24 hours resolution of fever and a note from the provider stating the individual has an alternate diagnosis and the provider believes it's appropriate for the patient to return to school. Let's look at another scenario. Let's say that the individual was not tested without an alternate explanation. In that case, if the individual is symptomatic, they must remain home for at least 10 days from the first day symptoms appeared. And this goes to show the importance of that self-screening daily, right? And 72 hours fever-free without fever-reducing medicine and with improvement of respiratory symptoms. What about if the individual tested and was negative? Again, if they're symptomatic and no alternative explanation is available, they are to isolate for at least 10 days. And remember what the definition of isolate was provided at the bottom of page 1. But again, they're to isolate for at least 10 days from the first day symptoms appeared and 72 hours fever-free without fever-reducing medications and with improvement of respiratory symptoms. It's important to remember that the test may have been a false negative. The individual can return to school if tested negative and with a note from the healthcare provider stating that they believe the patient to have an alternate diagnosis and that it's appropriate for the patient to return to school. What if tested and negative with no symptoms? In that case, the individual may proceed with attending school, but there is an exception that the Indiana State Board of Health provides that a known close contact, as defined by within 6 feet of a confirmed case for more than 15 minutes, must complete a 14-day quarantine. Remember the definition at the bottom of quarantine, even if test results are negative for COVID-19. Next, what if the individual is tested and positive and symptomatic? Well, they must remain home in isolation. Remember the definition of isolation for at least 10 days from the date symptoms began and 72 hours fever-free without fever-reducing medications, along with improvement of respiratory symptoms. Let's say that the individual tested, they're positive, but there's no symptoms. In that case, they must isolate at home for 10 days from the day the test was taken. Please note, if the individual develops symptoms, then isolation time starts on day 1 of the symptoms. And it says, please see symptomatic test positive section. Okay, so again, the importance of that daily self-screening and awareness of these symptoms. It goes back to our plans. It goes back to our top 10, right? Last on this page, close contact, which is defined as 6 feet or more than 15 minutes of someone with confirmed COVID-19. So in that case, if I've been in close contact as an individual, which means within 6 feet for more than 15 minutes of someone with confirmed COVID-19 and I have symptoms, if an individual becomes symptomatic, I must refer then to the symptomatic scenarios. If the individual is symptomatic, then they must quarantine for 14 days after contact with the COVID-19 positive person, even if the student has an alternate diagnosis for symptoms. Last, if I am in close contact as defined without symptoms, I have to quarantine for 14 days before returning to school, and I must remain symptomatic free. If the individual develops symptoms, in that case, refer back to the symptomatic scenarios. So again, these are all listed here as provided by the Indiana State Department of Health. And this is something we would highly recommend, along with that top 10 and the documents we've provided, that we are regularly going back to, as we know that is our responsibility to protect ourselves and protect others and protect our community, to be aware of these things and to report these things. The second page shows essentially 3 scenarios for a positive COVID-19 test and 3 scenarios as relating to a negative COVID-19 test. And so here's the first example. And you'll notice that they give a graphic as relating to the positive COVID-19 test, and they give 3 scenarios. The graphic aligns with each scenario. So the first one, for example, let's say that the student gets tested for COVID-19 at a testing event put on by a community organization. The student was symptom-free when he got the test. The test, though, comes back positive. In that case, the student must isolate and stay symptom-free for 10 days after the date he took the test. Remember to go back to the definitions of isolation and quarantine. Scenario 2, positive test. Student gets tested for COVID-19 at a testing event put on by a community organization. Though the student was symptom-free when she got the test comes back positive. The student starts isolating for 10 days after the date she took the test. 4 days into isolation, let's say the student develops a fever and a cough. Now what? The student now must isolate at home for at least 10 days and 72 hours fever-free without fever-reducing medicine and with improvement in respiratory symptoms. The student ends up isolating at home, in this case, for 14 days. The last example here provided for a positive case. Let's say the student tests positive and has 3 siblings in the home or as close contacts who attend other schools. If the siblings have symptoms, then they should be tested and report to that school if tests are positive. Otherwise, siblings should quarantine for 14 days before returning to school. It's important to note that contacts of the siblings are not considered a close contact unless the siblings test positive themselves. And then the last part of this document on the second page, what about 3 scenarios for a negative COVID-19 test? Let's say that the student has a fever, a cough, and a headache, and a loss of taste and smell. The student goes to get tested, but the test is negative. However, there's at least a 30% chance of having a false negative test. Therefore, Indiana State Department of Health says it would still be required that this student isolate, remember the definition of isolate, at home for at least 10 days and 72 hours fever-free without medication and with reduction in respiratory symptoms. Scenario 2 for a negative COVID-19 test. Let's say the student has a fever and a sore throat and history of getting strep throat. The student sees her provider who does a strep test and exam and believes the patient has strep throat and does not have COVID-19. The student in this case may return to school after 24 hours, fever-free, with a note from her provider stating that she may return to school. And the last example given here by the Indiana State Department of Health for a negative COVID-19 test is that the student has a fever, cough, shortness of breath, and a loss of taste and smell. His parents in this case do not want to get him tested for COVID-19. The Indiana State Department of Health highly recommends that the student gets tested so that the proper contact tracing can be done. The student will need to isolate at home, in this case, for at least 10 days and go 72 hours fever-free without use of medication and have a reduction in respiratory symptoms. Additionally, if the school is suspicious that the student has COVID-19, the school could do contact tracing and monitoring for others with symptoms. So again, wanted to share that document with you. It's on our site. It is the student guidance for return to school. It's there for us to refer to, but as a reminder, we must notify our school immediately of COVID-19 symptoms or any exposure to a COVID-19 positive test. You would do so at nurse@hobart.k12.in.us. As always, thank you. Remember that we are all about working to protect our brickies. Until next time.